Hi, good afternoon. We're going to begin the webinar in just a moment or so. Give people a chance to log in. I'm going to go ahead and begin. Hi, I'm Donna Wright, Communications Manager of the Veteran Institute for Procurement, and I'd like to welcome and thank you for joining us for the VIP webinar, Multiple Award Contracts and How Small Business Can Get in the Game and Win. The webinar was developed with the goal to help veteran businesses accelerate your growth in the federal marketplace. And that is what VIP is all about, accelerating the success of veteran-owned small business government contractors, and it's working. On an average, companies grow 54% 1 year after graduation from the VIP program. VIP offers 3 different curriculums to give veteran-owned small businesses the tools they need to win government contracts. Programs are held in the Washington, D.C. area, just 11 miles from the White House. Participants receive hands-on market-based instruction that help establish best business practices for federal government contracting, and the program is offered at no cost. We currently offer VIP Grow, our core curriculum, VIP Start for veteran-owned small businesses looking to become procurement ready, and VIP expanded its curriculum and now offers VIP International to accelerate veteran small business success in the global marketplace. This webinar series is made possible thanks to the support of SBA. Its goal is to provide resources to the 20 veteran business outreach centers located throughout the country that support veteran-owned government contractors with entrepreneur development services such as business training, counseling, and mentoring. And it's also a resource for the VIP alumni to ensure their continued success in the federal marketplace. The slides and audio from this webinar will be made available on the VIP website at www.nationalvip.org. It is now my pleasure to introduce a leader in his field, Dan Snyder, the Deputy Director of Government Contracts Research with Bloomberg Government. He has demonstrated a history of consulting and providing analysis focused on GSA VA federal supply schedule. Dan will provide an in-depth overview showing how agencies will continue to use multiple award contracts to meet small business goals, how GWAC and FSS are a main source of MAC awards for small business, and how small business developers can build robust opportunity pipelines and maintain a competitive advantage using best practices. Now, I'll turn it over to Dan.
Hi, and good afternoon. As Donna explained, I'm a Deputy Director of Government Contracts Research with Bloomberg Government. In that capacity, I work with mostly business development professionals to help them find and win new work. So I want to, first and foremost, certainly thank the Small Business Administration and the Veterans Business Outreach Center for inviting me to speak and share my time with you today. So let's jump in. Before we begin on the individual slides, here you'll find a general overview of the topics that we will cover today. As Donna explained, we will begin with a general overview of the different types of multiple awards contracts, such as GWACs, GSA schedules, blanket purchase agreements, and all other individual agency MACs. From there, we'll look at which agencies are leveraging the majority of those MACs and which ones they most frequently turn to buy goods and services. And then we'll get into a more tactical approach that will hopefully share some techniques that I use on a daily basis to find multiple award contracts, and which ones agencies use and which ones you should be targeting within your specific core competencies. Another aspect of the webinar we'll certainly look at, given the time frame that we're at right now, the surge in spending that is expected to take place and that cyclical nature which will occur between now and the end of the fiscal year on September 30th. And then to finalize the presentation, we'll touch on a few multiple award contracts which are available for bid right now and that could be of potential interest to many of the listeners today. The first slide here, and I apologize if this is basic and this is known by a number of the people on the webinar today, but for those who may not be as familiar, I just wanted to provide which target areas we'll be discussing today. So the first slide here will show the different types of procurements and bids and awards that the government uses. So initially, we'll start with an RFI, request for information or sources sought, and that gives the government a chance to solicit interest in the particular good or service being purchased before a formal RFP for bid is released. The second stage of the procurement life cycle consists of a competitive agreement between the government and the contractor, an agreement through a vehicle, also known as a multiple award contract, which will go in depth today, or they can choose to sole source the contract with a written justification why they're choosing a single vendor, and that's known as a sole source agreement to a single company. After the bid process is defined, there's two types of awards the government can elect to use. They can choose to go with one company and have a definitive written agreement, or they can choose to use multiple vendors and compete them under task orders. So for the purpose of today, we'll be looking at that second box most specifically, and the vehicles that those agencies use under the second bullet and the third box as well for multiple award contracts. A few important notes that I wanted to at least highlight at the bottom there are the types of competitions that the government is using. If you look at the second bullet there, you'll see most procurement opportunities use traditional methods, but not non-traditional methods as well. So one that I wanted to at least take a moment of pause to highlight is how agencies are going beyond multiple award contracts and using innovative techniques to compete opportunities that may be of interest to you. The first that I'll explain is something known as Other Transaction Authority, or OTAs. And the reason that's important and something I wanted to highlight today is because we've seen an increased usage in OTAs, most specifically at the Department of Defense. And that's going to allow the government to compete awards using a consortia. So a consortia is a relatively low barrier to entry, and you can submit or submit a claim to join a consortia for usually in the neighborhood of $500, which would then allow you to respond to white papers or also in the format that would be a bid to win any of those OTA, any of the work competed using Other Transaction Authority. So this webinar will focus on MACs, but I did just want to highlight that specific area as well. And then there's also an increased usage lately to do the agency-sponsored contests as well. One specifically that I saw just released this week is the Air Force is submitting innovative ideas and looking for commercial solutions for innovative approaches to cybersecurity. So in that capacity, companies will submit their ideas to the agency, and then present them in a seed type project for something that could develop in the future. So both of these represent ways that the government may have limited commitment, but can evolve to a more sophisticated and more mature solution down the road. The third bullet before we move on, again, is having your SAM information and dotting your I's and crossing your T's. As we will touch on some of the topics today, a lot of the procurements that take place in the fourth quarter and throughout the fourth quarter are because they like to use multiple award contracts because they allow them to operate more efficiently. So the reason I want to pinpoint DUNS numbers and SAM is that it's worthwhile to go in and check your information, check your point of contact, check your reps and certs, make sure everything is up to date so that there's no cause for concern in the future that would prevent you from winning any of those orders under a multiple award contract. If any of that information is false or invalid, the government withholds the right to withdraw that offer, and we certainly don't want that to occur. The next slide here, again, sticking with some of the basics and many of the elements that probably most procurement professionals are familiar with, is when we look at a request for proposal, it can somewhat be overwhelming. Many of them are 200 or 300 pages long, and we don't have the time to sift through all of them to determine if it's something of interest to us. So the purpose of this slide on the left is just to go through the general life cycle of a contract. And then more importantly on the right is as you're developing your business development strategies, you can somewhat disregard some of the information. Maybe disregard isn't the most appropriate word, but pay less attention to some of the more formality type language that's in that 300-page document so that you can focus and hone in on the really important matters. And those really important elements of the request for proposal are going to be found in section C, L, and M. Section C is probably the most important aspect of that request for proposal because it's going to identify exactly what the government is buying. So that's where you're going to tailor your solution or ultimately decide if it's something worth pursuing and warrants inclusion in your pipeline. The second and third are, of course, the instructions. You want to make sure that your bid is timely and appropriately complies with all of the directions that the agency has set forth. And then the third is the evaluation factors. And we'll get into this a little bit more so as we flip through the slides. But that could certainly weigh into your decision to bid or no bid a contract based on the effort it may take your company to dig through that. Increasingly in multiple award contracts, we have seen a scoring methodology where that requires the company to score themselves against competitors. And depending on the structure of those scoring proposals, whether it's scoring proposal, LPTA, or best value, can ultimately determine the amount of bid and resources that are allocated for a specific bid. So those are the three portions of the RFP that if you want to be more efficient in your time, that I would suggest focusing most specifically on doing your homework for. This next slide is just to familiarize ourselves with the different types of multiple award contracts. There are many definitions that are used sometimes inappropriately. So at least we want to make sure that everyone that listens today, if you don't take away anything else, will at least understand the fundamentals of the multiple award contract environment. Now you may ask yourself, why are multiple award contracts important and why do I care? To answer that question and why we've chosen this as a topic today, we will answer that by saying the whole government last year spent about $512 billion government-wide. A lot of that, or about half, was specifically on defense weapon systems that go to companies such as Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and others. If we set aside that half amount of the spending, we're left with still about $240 billion or so. of that amount that's addressable for most competitive companies to go after, about 120 to 140 billion is competed through multiple award contracts based off analysis that Bloomberg government has conducted throughout the past 3 years. So once we get into that 120 to 140 billion, we'll take a look at the different types of multiple award contracts of what is included in that specific pool of money. So the first one they're all typically indefinite delivery vehicles, which is the second bullet there. The indefinite delivery vehicles mostly consist of GWACs, Federal Supply Schedules, also known as GSA schedules. And then there's a third group, which would be multi-agency contracts, not to be confused with our multiple award contracts, multi-agency contracts, and enterprise-wide contracts. So as we go forth with this presentation, we'll take a look at which spending categories each of those fall into. But just so we have a basic understanding, there's 3 general types. So if you're referring to multiple award contracts with any of your procurement professionals, it's typically an indicator of a savvy professional if they can distinguish these 3 types. As we said, GWAC are only authorized by certain agencies, including Commerce, EPA, GSA, HHS, and NASA. GWACs are unique in the sense that they are only for information technology. Oftentimes, I find many people who I speak with will refer to government-wide acquisition contracts when they're not information technology contracts. So I want to make clear, the name can be a little bit misleading, but they're only for information technology type contracts, and would include some of the contracts we'll take a look at today, such as HHS's CIO SP3 or GSA's Alliant. The second type, as we said, is GSA schedules, and we'll define those more appropriately later on. But those constitute about $40 billion of government-wide spending and include 40 different categories that vary anywhere from furniture, information technology, or HR services. And then everything else falls into that third bucket, and that's the other multi-agency and enterprise-wide contracts. The last thing that we want to highlight before we move on is how enterprise-wide contracts work. Enterprise-wide contracts, a good example is DHS's Eagle for energy, is a vehicle established by an agency and mandated for use by bureaus underneath that agency. So when you see a MAC with an enterprise-wide tag associated with it, that's usually a pretty good indicator of something that you may want to go after, because you know all of those bureaus will be required to use it throughout its period of performance. The next slide here is a hypothetical situation. Again, I want to emphasize this is hypothetical and does not exist, but just to crystallize how multiple award contracts are constructed, we at Bloomberg Government set up this this model so that you could have a better understanding of what goes into these. So if we see on the left-hand side, I created a make-believe vehicle here at Department of Homeland Security under a general multiple award contract that was competed and eventually awarded to 4 contractors. It has a $5 billion year period of performance and includes a $1 billion ceiling. And after the first year, we illustrated on the right what may hypothetically exist under this contract. Now, the one thing that's most important about this contract is that not all companies are guaranteed work. Of course, under the multiple award contracts, as you see under the company A, company B, company C, and company D, you'll see the different disbursements of money which the government will compete once the multiple award contract is established. So once the contract was established a year ago, we had these four contractors, A, B, and C, who would then, in doing so, establish the ceiling rates that they would charge the agency for this particular vehicle. After a year, we see the second box in these companies, A, B, and C, and we see about 10 or so task orders under that multiple award contract that were awarded to these four companies. Now, an important thing to point out is they vary in size, as you see. They can vary in the length of that task order under the contract, and they can vary in the amount of transactions, or the third tier there, that would fall under the task orders and roll up to the contract. Again, before we move on, in this hypothetical too, we also want to point out that the contracting office manages and administers the contract. That is, they establish the terms and conditions by which that contract will be competed. So if we go back to the mechanics of our RFP, they're responsible for setting forth the instructions, responsible for describing the statement of work, responsible for establishing the evaluation criteria, and responsible for awarding the contracts. The funding agency, or where the task order money will actually come with and who these companies will work with on a day-to-day basis to deliver the government those goods and service, is provided by the funding agency. So in this example, it could be the case that DHS set this up and it's funded by several other agencies such as HHS or any others government-wide can use DHS's vehicle once it's established. So now that we've gotten past the basics, I want to highlight the next 4 slides or so. We'll dive into some of the tactics that you can use to identify these MACs and how you can better allocate your resources to figure out which ones make the most sense for your specific business. So from a top level view, the first thing that I do is figure out my game plan. And we'll go into this in a few more slides in our PWin or probability of winning theory. But first, you want to set forth a game plan of what your pipeline will look like. Most companies that operate in this space will establish the bandwidth. So that means how many contracts they can actually manage, how many contracts they can reasonably bid on. Again, given the small business resources, that's something that is worth thinking about because you don't want to waste your time on something you can't win. But before we do that, we want to take a look and see what's out there. So when we roll up our sleeves, and the first step we take to putting pen to paper is establishing our market classification for where we want to cast our search. And of course, that market classification will align with your specific business core competencies. So in this example here, I applied 2 types of classification search, which are relatively broad, of course, for information technology and professional services. Once you've established these, also, I guess these are prefixes to what are known as product service codes. So if you type this letter in, that's how you identify the particular market classification. And then as you add the 3-digit codes to them, you can get into a more granular search and refine it to suit your specific needs. But from a very basic level, and to cast our net as wide as we want, because we're not prejudiced towards which bids we would want to go after, and we have an optimistic view of the market, and we want to see everything that's available at our disposal, we customarily leave it pretty broad and would do just the letter to identify the number of solicitations that are coming out at each agency. From there, if we're conducting a search specifically on multiple award contracts, we've set our filter to that market classification, and the second step would then be to refine it to many of these opportunities that are being released by agencies. Now, of course, there's going to be a big fish that comes along every once in a while, and those will include your GWACs and other large multiple award contracts that are become household names based off the usage that agencies have. But at a very basic level, if you wanted to get some of the more competitive multiple award contracts that, and I use competitive in the terminology to mean that it has a high value, a medium-sized ceiling value, somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 million to 1 billion is usually the threshold that I would state that to be. And when those are established, those usually have a lower number of recipients. So anywhere in the neighborhood from about 6 to 12. And that would make it a competitive MAC, at least in my perspective. So once we want to find some of those, some of the common keywords that we would establish are multiple award contract, IDIQ, indefinite delivery, GWAC, etc. All of those terminologies that we looked at the beginning are how we want to refine our search within this particular market classification. And then again, going back to the original slides there, when we decide if it's something we want to put in our pipeline and respond to those MACs, it's going to be important to refer to section L and M to ultimately decide the degree of difficulty for meeting the evaluation set forth. A lot of the questions I may often ask myself consist of how many estimated contract awards are there. So if I say there's 6 to 12 and I'm looking at these competitive MACs, that's usually the range by which I would want to find. That's not to say I would disregard any larger or smaller, but that's usually a good indicator. The second question is, if I do win a slot, will I actually win work on the contract? And that's going to come down to pricing the contract, which we'll take a look at in a second. And then the third factor, as we touched on briefly in the beginning, is whether the evaluation is a scorecard, trade-off, or LPTA. Most often, I think you'll find that in most of the multiple award contracts would be a trade-off. So that is a best value trade-off that the government withholds the ability to use their discretion in identifying which companies offer the best qualified work that can be delivered. Okay, so now that we've taken a look at the specifics of how to find MACs and what is included in the MAC, the next question that we would ask ourselves is, what is the competitive assessment and how do I establish a price to win? So we won't go through all three of these phases, but this is generally, once you've identified a pool of likely candidates, the types of questions you would want to ask yourself. What challenges, issues, motivators are behind the agency's solicitation? Can I meet those challenges, and would I offer them a solution that they would find appealing? If the answer is yes, we move on to the second phase, and then we start getting into what our competitors are. So I think this is kind of the moment you look yourself in the mirror and say, in all likelihood, am I competitive? Do my socioeconomic designations allow me to compete for this multiple award contract? And then the third is pricing the contract. And there's different ways and different techniques to look at this. But at the very basic level, you want to make sure that it's going to be something the government has spent money on in the past and intends to in the future. So several of the techniques that we'll take a look at in the two next slides are, what has the agency budgeted? What have they set forth in the forecast that would lead me to believe that this is a meaningful bid that I should pursue? This next slide here, after we've taken a market view of those factors, is again a hypothetical situation that could be worth considering to help you evaluate your bid, no bid scenario. As we said before, the first, if it's possible, we want to know, is spending on the program forecasted to grow? Obviously, that's a good sign. If we know that they're in the third year of a program or initiative that's maturing at an agency, that's something we want to latch on and get involved in. But sometimes it's not as easily recognizable to understand. So certainly ask yourself that question. But if you do decide to do a bid, you don't know if you're competitive. There are some ways that you can work around to see if it's worth it. And the second one here is pricing a contract based on these assumptions. So no recompete information or predecessor contract exists. So what do you do from there? If you believe a recompete is probable, despite any formal documentation in the agency forecasts, we can develop a way to find out whether it's worth a bid pursuing that using the techniques in the table below. And I won't get in too much to the details here, but it's relatively self-explanatory. If you look at the different types of labor categories, you can kind of piece together exactly what the government or a competitor would put into a bid. So as you see here, we have high, median, and low. And I use this using publicly available information on similar type government-wide multiple award contracts to determine, am I willing to give up margins if this is the type of work that I would bid? So this somewhat relies on some industry knowledge, because you have to know, if a government has identified a project, this is what I would think myself and others would need to put on a project in order to fulfill the requirements. And if you see the difference, there's a pretty stark difference in the $3 million low end of the spectrum compared to the higher end $4.4 million end of the spectrum. So if you put together a similar type matrix, then you can say, I have a program manager in my artillery, I have an enterprise architecture, I have an information specialist, but mine are priced way higher and my bid's going to be about 5 million. It may be an indicator that this may not be a bid worth pursuing. So this is just another way to use publicly available information to ultimately arrive at your determination. Before you do that, though, another key indicator is using the additional public information that is available. And several resources are listed here, and identify ways that you can forecast opportunities and build out a pipeline. A lot of clients at Bloomberg Government often come to us and say, it's great to identify a bid that I want to pursue, but oftentimes it's too late. Most of the companies already are ahead of the game. So in response to that conundrum, I would offer up these suggestions. The first is using and leveraging as most often as you can agency procurement forecasts. So anyone that's unfamiliar with those, is agencies by law are required to submit a forecast of opportunities that they're going to compete within the next year or 5 years, whatever the case may be, based off what the agency shares. Now, if you take a look at everything that the agency's released, of course, it's going to be more comprehensive in the near-term years, or 1 to 2 years, than they would in the out years. But those agency forecasts can be found at acquisition.gov. And you can score the individual agency's pages to find what types of projects are slated to be competed. Another technique that's somewhat often overlooked is using contract spending data to locate future opportunities. So if we find an opportunity in the spending data that's expiring within the next fiscal year, we can generally assume that a recompete would occur for that opportunity as well. And that's another way that you can build out your pipeline to get ahead of the RFP. The second two categories here are specific to information technology markets, but are worthy of explaining because you want to understand Exhibit 53s and Exhibit 300s so that you know what the budget estimates are for those IT projects, and you know the capital asset plans or the blueprints of what these agencies are intending to spend on information technology. And then the federal IT dashboard is going to allow you to gauge how those agencies are performing on those investments as well. So you can use the federal IT dashboard in a competitive nature as well and look at the ratings that they receive. So if you notice within those bullets, there's about 7,000 federal IT investments, and there's detailed on 700 investments listed as major or high value. And those are going to include a red, yellow, or green. And the red, yellow, or green will indicate if the agency is on time and on budget. So the biggest indicator, if there's a red or a yellow, which is cause for concern, could mean that the contractor isn't performing well, or just that the agency needs to ramp up efforts on those work, and there will be more work coming out specifically for those opportunities. The next set of 4 slides, we've got about 25 minutes remaining, and I want to leave some time for questions at the end. So please, I've seen them coming in, and please feel free to continue to submit them, and we'll get to as many as possible towards the end. The next 4 slides are going to focus on specific agency spending and how you can use those as an indicator to strategically target your agency customers. So as you see here in the slide presented on the screen, it shows which agencies have spent less than they did in fiscal year 2018 than they did in 2017. And you can see DoD is up in both instances, whereas agencies such as Treasury, USAID, Veterans Affairs are down. So what does that mean? That means that they're going to be the agencies with the most dollars still to disperse come the end of the fiscal year before that money evaporates. And you know for a fact they're going to get it out the door, and you know for a fact they're going to need to do that quickly. So we assume that they'll leverage multiple award contracts to do so. Another point that I wanted to highlight is more of a budgetary overview, and that has been the recent increase in the budget caps that was established with the recently passed omnibus package. So if you understand before anything about the budget process, the House established spending limits which agencies could not increase. The importance of the recently passed omnibus package is that it increased those limits and gave the agencies more money to use. So how do we use this to our advantage is they're going to have more money at the end of the year. And again, we want to focus on those agencies and target them for winning more business within our companies. The next table here, again, is a resource to determine which agencies are most far behind in their spending for the fiscal year 2018. And you'll see many of the agencies such as Commerce, Homeland Security, HHS are among the list of people of agencies who are far behind in their spending and are likely to spend the majority in the fourth quarter. This the slide here, again, just illustrates exactly how much spending occurs at these agencies compared with the prior 3 quarters. So May will mark the end of the 3rd quarter, and you can see here that the 4th quarter wraps up spending, and when agencies will need to use the majority of their budgets before that money runs out. Again, here this illustrates the overall cyclical and predictable nature of that spending cycle in what we call the 4th quarter race to the finish. So my colleagues at Bloomberg Government describe it more as the spending cycle starts as a marathon and ends as a full-on sprint. And as you see on the chart on the left, you can certainly see that to be the case. There's a minor spike in June at the end of the 3rd quarter, but by and large, much of that spending throughout the fiscal year will ultimately occur in September. And not just in September, as the chart on the right shows, the majority of that will occur in really the last week or so of the fiscal year. So if we know that most of the spending will occur in the last week of the fiscal year, we also know that there won't be a lot of time to compete that work. They'll have to get it on contract quick. And how will they do so is using multiple award contracts. As we see here, this is the majority of small business multiple award contracts that agencies have used since fiscal 2013. And a lot of these at the top, again, as we focused on specific markets, apply to information technology and professional services. And they are all multiple award contracts, which are available to compete for either as a prime or subcontractor. So the first one is GSA's IT 70 for information technology. It has about 5,000 contractors that compete for that work, which has generated about 18 billion for small businesses alone since fiscal 2013. The second is also a GSA schedule, professional services. The third is Seaport E for professional services, which is coming up for a recompete, and we'll end our conversation specifically on that one. But if you go back to this resource, it is important to understand in the fourth quarter, if you don't hold a slot on some of these, it may be worthwhile to pursue these contracts and find contract holders and perhaps try to subcontract work on any of these contracts, because this is how most of the work will be satisfied. The next slide here, as we said, we wanted to highlight the importance of two of the three categories. This illustrates just the high capacity of spending that goes through those two different types of multiple award contract spending. Now, there's only about 13 or so government-wide acquisition contract vehicles, which are listed on the left-hand side here. On the right-hand side, we also noted that the GSA schedules, or also as they're referred to, federal supply schedules, have a variety of different types of services that they provide. So if we look at the list on the right, Schedule 70 is for information technology. PSS is professional services for professional services requirements. 84 refers to law enforcement or solutions that would meet police force needs. 71 is for furniture, 36 is for office supplies, so on and so forth. So you can see just how robust that market is. In total, there's about 20,000 contractors that compete for those dollars. And the appealing factor for small businesses is that they're always open admission. So if you're ever interested in submitting a bid for GSA schedules, you could apply and set forth a bid on any of these contracts throughout any time throughout the fiscal year. And generally, after doing so, it takes somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 9 months to negotiate that contract. This next chart here again shows some of the common IT multiple award contracts. As we see, most of them are GWACs and federal supply schedules. And then you'll notice a few intermingled agency-specific multiple award contracts, such as NetSense, FirstSource, T4NG, or DHS Eagle. So there's several that don't meet that criteria, but are also worth exploring at the different agencies. Again, the same view from the professional services market overview identifies the professional services schedule, Seaport E. Oasis Small Business, which was awarded in 2014, are among the highest level of dollars that are going to small businesses. And then our final slide here, before we cap off our what's ahead, I just wanted to identify a few actionable items that are coming up for recompete that may be worth many of the recipients pursuing who are listening today. So the first of which is GSA's Oasis Small Business on-ramps. And the on-ramp is in follow-up to the initial awards, which occurred in 2014. And as early as last month, GSA has indicated that they'll be holding an event in May in Massachusetts to better let people understand what the on-ramp procedure is going to include. So if you're interested in perhaps a slot on OASIS Small Business, that could foreshadow that the formal solicitation for an on-ramp procedure could be forthcoming in the near future. The second vehicle I wanted to highlight is the Navy Seaport Next Generation. So throughout our spending analysis today, we saw a lot of amounts listed in the upper echelon that included Seaport E. That vehicle will ultimately be eclipsed by this next vehicle, Seaport Next Generation. And that's also going to be an appealing one because they do a lot of small business work, and there's also a low barrier to entry. So right now, I think the vehicle Seaport E holds about 3,000 to 4,000 contract holders, and that's going to be superseded by Seaport NXG. And if you have any work at the Navy, you're pretty much guaranteed to get a slot on the upcoming vehicle, and there's still plenty of time to respond. The third one is somewhat less unknown. We don't know, there hasn't been a formal RFP release yet or an acquisition strategy defined, but it's going to provide quality improvement for healthcare clinicians, and that's at CMS, and that has a $25 billion ceiling, and there's an industry day taking place at the beginning of May. So again, still plenty of time to participate in that competition. And then the fourth is VA's Commodities Enterprise Contract Next Generation, and that's going to be for IT hardware, and it includes a ceiling around $5 billion, and that's completely to small businesses as well, and it's at the Veterans Affairs. So as veteran-owned small businesses, that could certainly be one worth considering as you build out your pipelines. So what's ahead? Again, just to recap before we transition to the last 10 minutes and take some of the questions that have been coming in. Just to emphasize, all of these spending patterns will continue to take place, and we'll use these multiple award contracts that we analyzed today. So it could be savvy to take a look at that fourth quarter spending. Manipulate your filters to understand how those contracts are being used at the agency, and then target those agencies for a prime bid if you are a contract holder, or if you're not, look at the prime contract holders and pitch your capabilities as a subcontractor in support of those efforts. And with that, I will again also very thankful to the SBA and the VIP program, and I'll switch gears and take a few of the questions. So the first question is, how do we get information about consortia? Are they published on agency websites or FBO? They are. The answer is sometimes. So they're sometimes issued to FBO, but not all the time. More often than not, they're managed by an organization, and there's no consolidated source where you can look at all the ones available. The biggest one that we've seen in terms of consortia is C5. And again, that includes, I think, about 400 participants who compete and respond with white papers for that work. It costs about $500 to join. We have been compiling a list of consortia at Bloomberg Government, and in total, we've seen about 20 to 25 individuals consortia that have emerged in the past fiscal year. So again, C5 will likely continue to dominate the market share in terms of the competition that occurs through OTAs. But there's new ones that, again, are certainly worth having on your radar. The second question is, where do we get more info on how to join a consortia? The Army Contracting Command, I know, has taken the lead on advertising what needs to go into OTAs. I'm also happy to send some additional resources out to any of the recipients today in terms of which ones may be most appealing for you to target. As I said, C5 is one of them, and they typically do IT innovation and weapons upgrades. But if you'd like that list, we can share that with the recipients today, so you can see the individual types of consortia and what they're most interested in delivering to the agencies. The next question is, given the amount of work it takes to do BD and build a pipeline, how do you recommend a small business do this amount of work before they afford to bring on a full-time BD position? That's a great question. I think it's going to depend on the specific agency or on the specific company, and of course depend on what you need to fulfill the work that you have on your plate already. But before I would recommend officially onboarding a BD person, I would probably like to have 1 or 2 contracts secured at the very least. The next question is regarding simplified acquisitions. I don't know if I'm understanding it completely, but I know that the government is looking at increasing the thresholds. A lot of the simplified acquisitions occur under these multiple award contracts and have no requirements for competition. I know some agencies, Defense Department is increasing the thresholds in some areas upwards of $10,000 or so, where it doesn't have to be competed. And there is a flag within FPDS or any market research tool that you're using that you can use a flag to see which contracts are generating the most simplified acquisitions. So if you wanted to build that into your pipeline, I would suggest manipulating the data in such a way that would allow you to reveal that level of granularity. I'm just trying to get through all of the questions here. I apologize for the delay. In a product sales only company, which contract vehicle would be the most likely to allow for success? If I had to answer that government wide, I would overwhelmingly identify NASA SEWP as the most common multiple award contract used by any agency. Of course, you have to take into consideration the customer because it will depend on those factors as well. For example, at the Army, they have ITES 3H, which is, they have ITES 2S for services and ITES 2H for hardware. So if you're trying to sell into the Army, ITES 2H is probably your best case. Any other agency, I would suggest NASA SEWP or GSA Schedule 70. We have another question on the slides, and of course, just as a reminder, they will be emailed to all participants. Can you briefly explain how one agency can share federal dollars? So that's somewhat of a difficult response. I guess to clarify, they don't share the dollars in the hypothetical example that I set forth. They share the contracting management responsibilities. So they don't necessarily offset one treasury account with another. They must use the funds allocated for that agency. Now there is, if you want to interpret it in terms of shared services at an agency, in which an agency, you can establish common types of services that are used the same at each agency. I guess that could be interpreted as shared funds. But there's certainly a division of allocated dollars and dispersed dollars that is abided by within each of these agencies. Are there any MACs on medical supplies and equipment? Yes, the Veterans Affairs is probably the most common one that's used for medical supplies and equipment, but there's also several at HHS and CMS specifically. If we wanted to use those techniques to identify which those are, I would suggest, again, using those market classifications or product service codes, and then selecting a filter for an agency to see the most common ones used at that agency. One question is, do we have a list of MACs for professional services, NAICS code 541611? Yes, we do, but I also would recommend a lot of the market classifications that we like to apply when we're analyzing a market is GSA's category management. They have a more comprehensive list of professional services MACs. Of course, the overwhelming amount would fall under this NAICS code. But they have a set of NAICS codes that identifies $73 billion in total spending, and you can see which MACs are the most popular at each agency. I think we've got time for maybe one more question. Before we conclude here, I want to be conscious of everyone's times. Where do we find the agency budgets? That also is a good question in terms of there's a lot of ways to answer that. The most common website that is used by clients is, of course, OMB's page. They list the president's budget there, and they have budget authority documents. I will say that they are somewhat laborious to go through. We at Bloomberg Government have a dashboard that I use more frequently. I don't know if there's any free ones available, but you could look at those individual agency documents and, of course, use those to find any new pockets of money. One of the big areas that our clients have been focused on is the opioid money, which allocated about $15 billion or so. So you can find those new pockets of money that may be allocated in the upcoming fiscal year and target those new areas that you may not be aware of. So I think that will conclude our portion. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining today. I really appreciated spending my time with you, and I look forward to any follow-up questions, and enjoy the rest of your week and weekend.
Okay, thank you, Dan, for your excellent presentation on the multiple award contracts, how small business can get in the game and win. And thank you to all our participants for attending the VIP webinar, and to the SBA for making this webinar possible. Again, we hope you found the information presented to you helpful. I would like to ask that you take a moment to complete the very short survey that will be sent to you immediately following this program. Your feedback is very important to us. Thank you, and we wish you continued success in 2018. And again, all materials will be posted on the www.nationalvip.org, and all participants will receive a copy of the recording shortly following the presentation today. Thank you. Have a great day.